The day that I came home from Cuba, I was met with a meal of stewed beef and kale and ugali, Kenyan-style cornmeal mash, made by my husband as a traditional welcome back feast after my arduous journey. I had brought back gifts and stories, and over this wholesome meal and cuddling my cats, I told my partner more than I could ever over the shaky cell phone connection I had in Cuba. The more I spoke, the more I realized that my experience in Cuba had changed me. In just 5 days, I found a depth of conviction about the story I was writing, HAVANA Syndrome. And I also found that my feelings about a concept that I had such unshakable faith in, my family, had also changed. My husband likes to say that I am dealing with some chthonic primordial shit. His words. And yeah, that's what this is. And the things shoved down in the dark tend to resurface. And it's not pretty. My uncle condemned to decades in prison for a crime we don't talk about. The murderous Menendez brothers.
My name is Eric Menendez. My name is Lyle Menendez, calling you from Donovan Correctional Facility.
The guns and war criminals smuggled in cars. The Obama birtherism and warmongering. The ghost of my great-grandfather who haunted me in his bitterness. Yeah, this episode is not going to be pretty. It's going to bring up the primordial, the void, the forgotten, the neglected. It's going to be about my family.
Today, I can announce that the United States has agreed to formally reestablish diplomatic relations with the Republic of Cuba.
You know there's story going around about the CIA and they're trying to get, sending in the folks to get Castro.
Cuba maintains close relations with Russia and China, providing these actors with influence platforms to foment an anti-American
Florida State
agenda.
Court has ruled on the case regarding temporary custody of Elian Gonzalez.
I think you ought to have that. It's incredible. I don't believe this thing in the world could. I don't think we ought to seriously consider it, but I think you ought to know about it.
The progress that we mark today is yet another demonstration that we don't have to be imprisoned by the past. When something isn't working, we can and will change.
One of the things that the Cuban side of my family praises, and I often agree with, is how close and loyal our family is towards each other. Historically, my family has proven that they are willing to look out for each other and support each other, even through crossing into a new country and building a new life. The attitude is that we're family. Of course, we must love each other. When shit hits the fan, they're the ones who show up. I grew up seeing this firsthand in the Thanksgivings and Christmases, in the vacations in Miami, and playing in the back of my grandparents' New Age store, and the spontaneous trips to Disney, the love and affection my grandparents had towards us and each other, the shenanigans us cousins got into under the eyes of aunts and uncles who danced and cooked and cared for us. As a kid who moved around a lot, I didn't have a lot that was steady in my life except for my family. I'm lucky to have parents who are still together, and I had a positive childhood in so many ways. A lot of that is rooted in Cuban culture, where affection and collective support was not just adages, but lived experience. At least it was for me. That really developed a loyalty towards my family, I think. A willingness to overlook the flaws because the love was so much bigger. That is, of course, until I got older and finally started hearing other stories. It started with my grandmother. This was the eve of Celia Cruz's death and heavily attended funeral, and my grandmother told me about her involvement in the Cuban Revolution, how she personally helped smuggle guns back to Cuba from Miami, her feelings of guilt about that. A passing joke that we were related to the Menendez brothers, Lyle and Eric, now subjects of Ryan Murphy's sleazy tabloid docudrama on Netflix called Monsters.
Eric and I killed our parents together, so I'd say that makes us pretty close.
Then there was a call I picked up when I was a kid at my grandparents' house. A collect call from a federal prison. A call I immediately hung up on in fear and confusion. A call from my granduncle, my grandmother's brother, who I did not even know existed until a decade later. My grandmother refuses to this day to tell me whether or not she even knows what he did to get sentenced for decades in prison. But I mean, it was the 80s in Miami. You can make some assumptions. I certainly have. I learned eventually that the children of this great uncle were essentially abandoned, and my great-grandparents decided to step in to raise them. Because that's what family does, right? You do it. You don't just talk about it. Then, of course, there was the racism. As my own political consciousness rose, and eventually around the time President Barack Obama was in office, it really began to be clear. There were comments that worsened, and I will commend my dad here. There was one particular instance where he really ripped into one of my family members for her comments. He used his position as the golden child, the hero of the family, to take a stand. That's something that I continue to do and continue to try to do through my stories. But that's the dynamic that started to splinter, the perfect image in my head, my own family pride. And once I came back from Cuba, the reasons for all of this started to circulate, percolate, and came forth in a nasty, traumatic wave. My granduncle in prison had been a military veteran, injured in Vietnam, another revolution, another fight against the communists, only to then wreak havoc and violence in Miami at the height of the drug epidemic. The Menendez brothers, who, according to their story, weathered abuse under a Cuban father who was a proud capitalist, and they struggled under their own proud family legacy, of course, until they snapped. My white Spaniard Cuban family, speaking with hate towards our first black president, a similar hate they usually reserved for Fidel Castro. And then there was me, falling for pride for my family and my own Cuban father, a military hero who had a deep connection to service for our country, and that drew me into a thirst to prove myself, even if that meant attempting to sign up for the CIA to unknowingly continue this vicious cycle. Stories of support twisted into stress under an imperfect image. It is brittle. It was probably inevitable that I would see it and struggle with it myself. This trip to Cuba came at a time when I wanted to write a story about my experience as a third culture kid and about the experience of my siblings as well. How this trip changed me also changed my writing. Or rather, it focused it, honed it, and my own feelings about why I have to be the one writing about these complicated issues. Because as I fell from my own pride, and as that image of the perfect family cracked under pressure, I had something to hold on to. And that was my writing. You see, there was something else about my family that I hadn't sat down to process. A few years ago, before my trip to Cuba, I had a cousin who had a serious event happen in their life and was confronting a whole lot of critique from my family about their choice. They told me about it. And after they did, they said something that shook me. They told me that when they told their parent they were going to talk to me about it, that parent said to them, "You know that when you tell Lisette, it's going to be real." Now, I'm sure that could be interpreted multiple ways, right? It could just mean that should they tell anyone about this choice, it meant that they would actually go through with it. But to have myself as the catalyst, as the person that the truth is told to, or that truth is revealed to or established with, that's quite the message, isn't it? Especially when the question of truth and reality has been filtered through family pride. Omissions for the sake of family pride. I am at a place in my life where I have fully embraced my role and my desire to be a storyteller. I wish to tell stories I wish to tell. But that has also meant telling my version of my family's stories. I mean, I was the only person who finally got around to writing my dad's survival story 20 years after the incident. All this to say, writing Havana Syndrome is a part of my personal synthesis. The trip to Cuba was a catalyst for me and my willingness to let the truth be told, the darkness revealed. Whether my family wants it or not, I brought back more than souvenirs from Havana. I brought back an anger. I brought back a haunting. The weeks following my trip to Cuba, my mental health took a turn. I won't go into deep detail. I became very isolated and confused about the intensity of my feelings. It was painful and disturbing, and I didn't quite have a place to put any of these feelings or place blame except internally. I also experienced a few incidents that pushed me further into depression than I had been in a very long time. And despite the fact I was around family for the holidays, I felt a distance from them that I never had before. I felt a resentment, an anger that was very hard to suppress, and to be honest, wasn't even related to anything they did, in spite of the void opening up inside of me. I still had a conversation with my grandparents about my trip to Cuba while I was visiting for the holidays. I wanted to gauge how willing they would be to go now that I had gone. Neither were particularly convinced, and that hurt. I understood, and even now I know it's probably impossible for them to go back even if they wanted to. They aren't in great health, and there's a distant possibility that the Cuban government could confiscate their passports. But it still felt like a distance was created. When I got back home, I was still struggling. I had written the first season of Havana Syndrome and was trying to find some place to get funding for it. I had one studio that was initially interested but was dragging their feet about it. I was also trying to build my business, Stormfire Productions, getting freelance clients and staring down the barrel of getting my business off the ground. I eventually accepted that I needed some guidance. While also under the care of a therapist, I also reached out to my spiritual mentor, Katrina Messenger, to talk. Now, I've been going to Katrina for spiritual guidance for years. It's similar as you would talk to a pastor or a rabbi or an imam. So we get to chatting, and I talk about my struggles, my negative self-talk, and the depression. We initially focused on some of what seemed to be the initiating incidents that happened around the holidays that had nothing to do with my trip to Cuba. But like any good mentor, she helped point me to the true initiating incident. I didn't understand it though. I was associating so many positive things with my trip, so many healing things too. Why would this darkness I was carrying be related to that? We went into a light meditation then to see if something would come up. All of a sudden, I could smell cigar smoke. The image of my great-grandfather came up. Katrina asked questions about him and about what I associate with him. I knew he was a very stern man, a bit of a misogynist. Chavismo is rooted deep in that side of the family. Heavy smoker, never Cuban cigars, of course. This was the man who forced my dad to promise not to smoke Cuban cigars until Castro was dead. This was the man who spoke up against Castro and was reportedly tortured for it. I'm not sure I ever remembered him smiling. My father looked up to him a lot and wanted to make him proud. He kept the family together, but I'm not sure if he was a kind man. As we continued to speak about him, this wave of bitterness and anger just grew, and it felt like it wasn't coming from me. It was coming from him. This conjured image, this ghost, was furious at me. Katrina dug deeper. Why would he be angry at me? Because I went to Cuba? No, because I was the one to go to Cuba. I wasn't supposed to be the first one back. I'm just a girl. It was supposed to be my father. As soon as those words came out, it was like a levee broke. My anger rose instead, bigger and wilder than his, and Katrina coaxed me to speak my mind to my great-grandfather. Fuck you. I was the one to have the courage to go back. To do this for me. For our family. And no, it was not the golden child or family hero. Not him. Not you. Me. The storyteller. The truth teller. And you're just gonna have to fucking accept that. Katrina asked me what I wanted from him. My ancestor. Just support the work that I'm doing, the story that I'm writing. You are long gone. I am the one who is alive now. I am the one who gets to write this story. And just like that, the anger shifted. I think there was sadness on the other side, with a hint of pride. You can believe me or not, whether this was a real conversation with a ghost or simply a mental construction. Either way, the darkness began to lift. Ease came back. I eventually cast aside the idea of allowing anyone else to produce my story, to tell my story, and started to fund the production of HAVANA Syndrome, all by myself. Mental health is not cured by seances, but like jars of dirt, sometimes they help. Yelling at the incorporeal manifestation of your family's patriarch is also pretty satisfying. Next time, the personal aftermath turns political, and the political is nuclear. Stay tuned, and thank you for listening.